You wake up before the alarm, not because you're rested, but because your mind has already started running, replaying conversations, anticipating problems that haven't happened yet, dissecting decisions that no longer matter, as if somewhere inside you there's a tribunal that never adjourns, a courtroom where every thought is put on trial, and you are both the accused and the judge, and no verdict ever brings peace. This is overthinking, not as a vague inconvenience, but as a deeply ingrained cognitive pattern rooted in survival mechanisms, your brain trying to predict threats, minimize risk, and maintain control in a world that refuses to be controlled. But what once helped humans survive in uncertain environments now traps you in loops of imagined futures and distorted pasts, draining energy, paralyzing action, and quietly reshaping your identity into someone who hesitates instead of acts. And yet, more thinking does not solve overthinking. That's the paradox. You cannot think your way out of a problem created by thinking. This is where Stoicism enters, not as abstract philosophy, but as a practical psychological toolkit forged in the harsh realities of life, designed not to eliminate thought, but to discipline it, to separate what matters from what doesn't, to restore authority over your own mind. Imagine, for a moment, that your thoughts are not commands, but suggestions. This is the first fracture in the illusion. Because overthinking thrives on the belief that every thought deserves attention, that if something appears in your mind, it must be analyzed, solved, or resolved. But Stoic thinkers understood something fundamentally different. The mind produces noise, just as the body produces sweat. Not all of it is meaningful. Not all of it requires engagement. And when you begin to see thoughts as events rather than truths, something subtle shifts. You stop reacting automatically. You start observing. There is a space now, small at first, between stimulus and response. And in that space lies control. Consider how often you replay a past mistake, convincing yourself that if you analyze it enough, you'll extract some final lesson that will justify the mental torture. But the Stoic approach dismantles this illusion with ruthless clarity. The past is fixed. It is outside your control. And anything outside your control is not worth emotional investment. This isn't denial, it's precision. It's understanding that your mental energy is finite, and every moment spent revisiting what cannot be changed is a moment stolen from what can. So instead of asking, "Why did this happen?" the Stoic reframes the question into something actionable. What can I do now? This shift sounds simple, but its impact is profound. It pulls you out of rumination and anchors you in the present, where decisions actually exist. And this is where overthinking begins to lose its grip, not because the thoughts disappear, but because you stop feeding them. Because attention is fuel. What you repeatedly attend to grows stronger. What you ignore weakens. Your mind is not a neutral observer, it is a reinforcement system. Every time you engage in overanalysis, you train your brain to continue that behavior. You build neural pathways that make overthinking more automatic, more habitual, more difficult to interrupt. But the inverse is also true. Every time you redirect your attention, away from useless speculation and toward meaningful action, you begin to rewire that system. Slowly, deliberately, you create a new default. And this is not motivational rhetoric. It is grounded in how the brain adapts. The Stoics didn't have modern neuroscience, but they understood its principles through observation and discipline. They practiced what we might now call cognitive distancing, learning to step back from their own thoughts and evaluate them with skepticism. Is this thought useful? Is it within my control? Does it lead to action or paralysis? These questions become filters, and over time, they sharpen your ability to detect mental noise. But perhaps the most powerful Stoic technique for overthinking is the dichotomy of control, a deceptively simple framework that divides everything in your experience into two categories: what you can control and what you cannot. Your actions, your judgments, your intentions, these are yours. Other people's opinions, the outcome of your efforts, random events, these are not. Overthinking thrives in the second category. It feeds on uncertainty, on outcomes, on things that exist beyond your influence. You worry about how others perceive you, how situations will unfold, whether your choices will lead to success or failure. But none of these are fully controllable. So the Stoic response is not to obsess over them, but to withdraw your emotional investment. You still act, you still plan, you still prepare, but you do so with the understanding that the result is not yours to command. And this changes everything. Because when you detach from outcomes, you free yourself from the anxiety that fuels overthinking. You focus on execution instead of speculation. The Stoics understood that clarity often comes after action, not before it. You don't think your way into confidence, you act your way into it. And this is why they emphasize deliberate practice, training the mind to tolerate uncertainty, to make decisions with incomplete information, to accept that mistakes are not catastrophic failures but part of the process. When you internalize this, overthinking begins to feel less necessary. Because you no longer see decisions as high-stakes gambles that must be perfected before execution. You see them as experiments, as steps, as iterations. And suddenly, the pressure decreases. The mental noise quiets. Because the mind no longer needs to simulate every possible outcome, it trusts that you can handle whatever happens. But this trust is not automatic. It must be built. And one of the most effective ways to build it is through negative visualization, a Stoic exercise that sounds counterintuitive at first. Instead of avoiding worst-case scenarios, you intentionally imagine them. Not to scare yourself, but to familiarize yourself with them, to strip them of their emotional intensity. What if this plan fails? What if people judge you? What if things don't go as expected? You walk through these scenarios calmly, rationally, and you ask, could I survive this? Could I adapt? And the answer, more often than not, is yes. Because humans are far more resilient than their anxious minds allow them to believe. And when you realize that even the worst outcomes are manageable, the need to overthink diminishes. Because overthinking is often driven by fear of the unknown, and negative visualization turns the unknown into something known, something examined, something less intimidating. It reduces the emotional charge that keeps you stuck. And as that charge decreases, so does the compulsion to analyze endlessly. But there is another layer to this, one that is often overlooked: identity. Overthinking is not just a habit, it becomes part of how you see yourself. You might think of yourself as someone who is careful, analytical, thoughtful, but beneath that identity, there is often a fear of being wrong, of making mistakes, of losing control. And Stoicism challenges this identity at its core. It asks you to redefine what it means to be a rational person. Not someone who thinks endlessly, but someone who thinks clearly and then acts decisively. Not someone who avoids mistakes, but someone who learns from them without emotional attachment. This shift in identity is critical, because behavior follows identity. If you see yourself as someone who needs to analyze everything, you will continue to overthink. But if you begin to see yourself as someone who values action, who accepts uncertainty, who prioritizes control over reaction, your behavior will start to align with that vision. And this is where real change happens, not in isolated techniques, but in the integration of those techniques into how you operate on a daily basis. Overthinking doesn't disappear overnight. It weakens through consistent practice, through repeated decisions to disengage from unproductive thoughts and engage with reality instead. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the mental noise that once dominated your mornings begins to fade. The courtroom goes quiet. The tribunal dissolves. And in its place, there is something unfamiliar, something simple, something you may not have felt in a long time: clarity. Clarity, however, is not the absence of thought, it is the refinement of it, the ability to direct your with intention rather than being dragged by it. And this is where the deeper Stoic techniques begin to transform from ideas into lived experience. Because once you recognize that overthinking is not a necessity but a pattern, you are faced with a more difficult task: breaking that pattern in real time. In the exact moments when your mind starts to spiral, when a single thought branches into 10, then 50, then 100, each one pulling you further away from action and deeper into analysis. And in that moment, the Stoics would not tell you to fight your thoughts or suppress them. They would tell you to interrogate them, not emotionally, but logically, almost like a strategist examining faulty data, asking with precision, is this thought within my control? Is it useful? and does it lead to action? Because if it fails these criteria, it is not worth your engagement, and this sounds almost mechanical, but that is exactly the point, because overthinking is fueled by emotional reasoning, by the tendency to treat feelings as facts, to assume that because something feels important, it must be true or urgent, when in reality, many of the thoughts that dominate your attention are distortions, exaggerations of risk, misinterpretations of other people's intentions, projections of your own insecurities onto neutral situations. And when you begin to analyze your thoughts with Stoic logic, you start to see these distortions for what they are, patterns rather than truths, habits rather than insights, and this realization creates distance. And in that distance, you regain authority, because you are no longer inside the thought, you are observing it, evaluating it, choosing whether it deserves your time. And this choice is the foundation of mental discipline, but discipline alone is not enough, because the mind, left idle, will always return to its default patterns, and this is why the Stoics emphasize purposeful engagement with the world, not as a distraction, but as a form of alignment, because when your actions are clear and intentional, your mind has less room to wander into unnecessary complexity. And this is something you can observe directly, when you are fully engaged in a task that matters. When your attention is anchored in execution, overthinking loses its momentum, it has no space to expand, and this is why one of the most effective ways to stop overthinking is deceptively simple. Do something, not impulsively, not recklessly, but deliberately. Take the next step that is available to you, even if it is small, even if it feels incomplete, because action creates feedback. And feedback creates clarity, and clarity reduces the need for speculation, and this cycle, repeated consistently, begins to replace the old loop of overthinking with a new loop of action and adjustment. And over time, this becomes your default, not because you forced it, but because you trained it. And yet, there will still be moments when your mind resists, when it clings to the illusion that more thinking will somehow produce certainty. And in those moments, the Stoic response is not frustration, but acceptance. Because even the act of overthinking is, in a way, outside your immediate control. It is a conditioned response, a reflex built over years, and you cannot eliminate it instantly. But you can decide how you respond to it, and this is where another powerful Stoic principle comes into play, the concept of assent, the idea that while thoughts may appear involuntarily, your agreement with them is voluntary. You do not control the initial impression, but you control whether you accept it as true, whether you allow it to dictate your behavior, and this distinction is subtle, but it is transformative. Because it means that even in the presence of overthinking you still have agency, you still have the ability to pause, to question, to redirect, and each time you exercise that ability, you strengthen it, like a muscle that becomes more reliable with use, and gradually, the gap between thought and reaction widens, giving you more time, more space, more control, and within that space, you can apply another Stoic technique that directly targets the emotional core of overthinking. The practice of reducing things to their essentials, stripping away the narratives and interpretations that your mind layers onto reality, and looking at situations in their most basic form, because overthinking thrives on complexity, on the stories you tell yourself about what something means, what it could lead to, how it reflects on you. But when you break those stories down, when you reduce a situation to its objective components, much of that complexity dissolves. What remains is often far less intimidating than your mind made it seem, and this is not about minimizing real problems, but about seeing them clearly, without distortion, without exaggeration, and from that clarity, more effective decisions emerge, not perfect decisions, but sufficient ones, and this is another critical shift, because overthinking is often driven by the pursuit of perfection, the belief that there is a single correct choice that must be identified before action. And the Stoics reject this entirely. They operate on the principle that what matters is not choosing perfectly, but choosing rationally and then adapting as necessary, because the world is dynamic, unpredictable, and no amount of analysis can account for every variable, so instead of trying to eliminate uncertainty, they train themselves to function within it, to remain steady regardless of outcome. And this steadiness is what ultimately dissolves the need for overthinking, because when you trust your ability to handle whatever happens, You no longer feel the need to preemptively solve every possible problem. You act, you observe, you adjust, and this process becomes natural, almost automatic. And as it does, something else begins to change, something deeper than your thought patterns, your relationship with control itself. Because at the core of overthinking is a desire to control outcomes, to guarantee success, to avoid failure, to predict the future with enough accuracy that nothing catches you off guard. But this desire is fundamentally incompatible with reality. And the Stoics understood this with absolute clarity. They did not seek to control the uncontrollable. They sought to align themselves with it, to accept that uncertainty is not a flaw in the system, but a feature of it, and that resisting it only creates unnecessary suffering. And when you truly internalize this, not as an idea, but as a lived principle, overthinking loses its foundation, because there is nothing left to control in the way you once tried to control it. There is only what you can do in this moment, with the information you have, and the willingness to face whatever comes next. And this is where the transformation becomes visible, not in dramatic shifts, but in subtle changes in how you move through your day. You make decisions faster, not because you are careless, but because you are no longer paralyzed by the need for certainty. You recover from mistakes more quickly, because you do not attach your identity to them. You spend less time in your head and more time in reality, because you recognize that thinking is only valuable when it leads to action, and gradually, the mental noise that once felt constant becomes occasional, then rare, and eventually, it becomes something you can notice without being consumed by it. Like background static that no longer demands your attention, and in its place, there is a different kind of one that is quieter, more focused, more deliberate, not because it has fewer thoughts, but because it has better ones, thoughts that serve a purpose, that lead somewhere, that support the life you are actually living rather than the one you are endlessly simulating. And this is the real promise of Stoicism, not the elimination of difficulty, not the achievement of perfect calm, but the development of a mind that is resilient, disciplined, and free in the only way that truly matters. The ability to choose your response, to act with intention, and to let go of everything else. And when you reach this point, even briefly, you begin to understand something that once seemed impossible, that the constant overthinking you believed was part of who you are was never fixed, never permanent. It was trained, and because it was trained, it can be untrained, replaced, reshaped, and what remains is not emptiness, but clarity. Not silence, but direction, and in that direction there is momentum, and in that momentum, there is progress, and in that progress, there is something far more valuable than the illusion of control. There is peace.